this evening, and we certainly are living through some historic times in terms of health issues, economic issues, social issues, and certainly environmental issues with climate change as well. And if you think about facing all four of those specters at the same time, it really is pretty incredible. And so I think it's very timely to kind of look back, as the saying goes, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so I think there's a lot to be learned by looking back, and our river has helped shape a lot of history that shaped this country. And so when we put out the survey of what topics we wanted to offer through these webinars, we got a strong response that looking at history and America's founding river was of strong interest. And so immediately Bob Deems came to my mind because we have partnered a number of times in the past on this subject. And Bob is a wealth of knowledge and really diverse and expansive knowledge. Long career in journalism, which I'll say began with the paper route delivering the Times-Dispatch here in Richmond. And then he was a reporter for papers in Charleston and Atlanta, maybe some other places too, but I know about those two places. And then lived in places like Tokyo and was a White House correspondent as well. He now works for the Natural Resource Defense Council in communications. I apologize for the phone ringing in the background. And while he's been there, and that's a national environmental advocacy organization, really does incredible work at national and international level. But while he's there, he has written two books, one on the BP oil spill and another on climate change. And I've seen, Bob, I don't know anything about it, but I saw that you've released your first novel this year, The Bicycle Man. I hope you'll share a little bit about that. But the book that we really got to know each other over is what he released in 2007, the year of the 400th anniversary of Jamestown, the settlement of Jamestown. And the title was The River Where America Began. It was at the same time that I was working on getting a resolution through Congress to name the James as America's founding river. So Bob has been a wonderful partner in talking about the history that's happened along the river and how significant that is still today. And so the one last note I will share with you is something that Bob shared early on. He said that most of the book, The River Where America Began, was written between 4 and 7 a.m. So this was indeed a passion of his. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Bob, and he's gonna just share some remarks to begin with, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation, and then happy to open it up for questions or comments. And if you have questions along the way, as Sarah said, please enter them in the chat box, and we'll get through as many as we can. So Bob, thanks so much for joining us and being persistent and getting on this Zoom call. Bob, are you there? Let's see. You're on mute. Can you unmute him, Sarah?
Unmute.
There you go.
Is that better? Okay.
We can hear you.
I can be trained. I can learn. Anyway, thanks so much, Bill. And I think as Bill made clear, I'm a huge fan of the James River Association and the vital work that it does. And Bill and I did meet in the spring of 2007. When he called me, he came to Capitol Hill, and he said, I would like you to sign a copy of your book for every single member of the Virginia delegation in Congress as he was getting this resolution passed. And I said, this is a man after my own heart. This is shoe leather advocacy on behalf of a great cause. And Bill Street is just one of the most mission-driven men in America. He's a great river keeper, and I'm just real proud to call him my friend. As Bill said, of course, tomorrow is Juneteenth. It marks 155 years since the official end of slavery in America, and it comes at a time when we're undergoing an enormous reckoning of our own history, and particularly our history with race in America. And I don't think there's a better starting place for us, really, than to look at the way that our history has been told, look at the voices that have been included and the voices that have been dimmed, the voices that have been distorted, the voices that we simply haven't heard from. And of course, the James River is the right place to start. It is, as Bill said, the nation's founding river. It is unique. It is the place where three ancient civilizations, African, European, and Native American, first came together permanently on this continent to form the beginnings of a new civilization that would change the world. And yet at the same time, as we celebrated or commemorated just last summer, it is not only the place at Jamestown where we had the first democratically elected body in the Western Hemisphere meet, but that very same month that that body adjourned from a rickety old wooden church in Jamestown, the first Africans to arrive in English America in chains came up the James River. So we had this unfathomable historical irony wherein the seeds of democracy and the seeds of slavery were sown in the very same soil on the banks of the James River 400 years ago last summer. And here we are today. Obviously, so much has happened since then, but we are still dealing today with the consequences of that interaction. And what I tried to do in the book was to start in 1619 with a look at the kind of world it was, because it was a world where there was global military conquest, Europeans conquering peoples in Africa and in the Americas, both sides of the Atlantic. It was a world of economic exploitation. It was a world of political subjugation. Slavery played a key role in all of that. And it was also a world where, for the first time, nations were beginning to build global empires fueled by their ability to project a blue water navy, to assemble global capital in a new thing called a joint stock company. And all of this was coming together. All of these factors came together at Jamestown. So Jamestown wasn't some product of something unique to Virginia, but it uniquely came together, these global forces there, at a time when so many nation states were fighting for their very survival. We tend to focus on England naturally, but we forget that the true superpowers of that day were Portugal and Spain. England was about a century behind those two countries in learning how to project itself globally to economic ends. And so this is where Virginia begins. This is where British Empire in America begins. This is where democracy in America begins. This is where slavery in America begins. And when we talk about the founding river, we have to remember the James River was the river of Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote our Declaration of Independence, first put quill to parchment in a little one-room schoolhouse on a James River plantation just west of Richmond called Tuckahoe. This was the river of Patrick Henry, who started out as a lawyer in Goochland and delivered his famous Liberty or Death speech in St. John's Church there on Church Hill in Richmond, within hearing distance of the rapids of the James River. And it was the River of Washington, who rendezvoused with French forces at Jamestown, of all places, to attack the Redcoats in Yorktown and bring an end to British Empire in America just 15 miles from where it began. And yet, if this was the river of Jefferson and Henry and Washington, it was also the river of Antony and Isabel, the first African-American family of record in this country. It was the river of Gabriel, a Richmond slave named for an angel of God, who led a slave revolt and was hanged in Richmond within sight of both St. John's Church and the white column temple to American democracy of the Virginia state capitol that had been designed by Jefferson himself. And so when we think about this river and all that has meant to us in this country, we have to include all of that history as well. This kind of history has the capacity to tear people apart. When you look back at the history of inequity and injustice and brutality and oppression in this country, there is so much of it right there along the James River. And yet at the same time, it has the power, I believe, and I believed when I wrote the book, to pull us together as a nation. And that starts when we tell the more faithful story about who we are as American people. Not only the so-called great men that we study in our history books, but the legions of people who came over here against their will and with their bare hands carved out of these malarial swamps and boggy bottomlands along the river, some of the most productive agricultural land in the history of the world. That was a remarkable achievement. It was a form of genius. And when you combine it with the fact that while they were doing that, these people kept faith through the long nightmare of slavery with their unfathomable will to be free, it is one of the greatest stories ever to be told. It's a story we need to do a better job of telling. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, one of the reasons I'm happy to be talking about it today, but we're just getting started on this. And I do believe that telling this richer, fuller story about who we are is not only an essential part of the national reckoning we're having today with race, but it's an essential part of our mission, the mission of democracy in America, to pull together the judgment of the whole, the collective genius of the nation, and the common will to build a more just and equitable society where every voice is heard, every voice is counted, every vote is counted, and we, the people, are truly sovereign. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to respond to your questions. Thank you so much, Bill.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob. So I've got a few questions I'm going to lead off with, Bob, but then would love to have this be really just a conversation, as the title implied. So Bob, first, what gave you the idea of writing the book? This was your first book, and sort of what gave you that drive to get up at 3 or 4 in the morning, all those mornings, and persevere while still maintaining your other job to complete this book? And I'll say I talked to a number of people who wanted to produce books in 2007, but many of them didn't. And you had to be driven to do that. So kind of what was behind that?
Yeah, thanks so much, Bill. I really was driven, and it was daunting. I didn't really have any idea how to go about it at first, but I did learn a lot along the way. The inspiration of it really came from my daughter. She and I, Maisie, I guess Maisie was 6 or 7, and we took a journey to the headwaters of the James, and we kind of waded into this little creek, and I looked down and saw Maisie. It was the 5th day of July, hot day, and Maisie had slipped out of her little sandals and waded into the stream, and she dipped down and cupped her hands. And I said, "What are you doing, Maisie?" She said, "I'm taking a drink. Now I'll always have the spirit of the James in me." And the weeks that followed, Bill, I kind of toyed around with that phrase, and it sort of dawned on me slowly that whether we drink from these waters literally or figuratively, all of us as American people do have the spirit of the James in us. Mm-hmm. This river does run through the heart of our history and all that we are as American people. And it just seemed to me, the more I thought about it and then started doing some reading and research on my own, the James River is a unique stage for telling the story of this nation's beginnings.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And how old is Maisie now? I'm hesitant to ask.
No, Maisie is now 24.
Oh my gosh.
I could still probably get her on my shoulders, but not as easily as I did on that morning. And and she works for Congressman Joe Cunningham from South Carolina's 1st District. So
Got it. Very
she's,
good. So in your research, in preparing the book, what was the most surprising thing that you discovered?
I think the most surprising thing to me, Bill, was the way the story hung together. You know, I knew the bookends were going to be Jamestown and Lincoln coming up the river in the final days of the Civil War, the final days of his life, to the still smoldering capital of the Confederacy, Richmond. And it's an extraordinary situation where he arrived in Richmond down there near Maury Street in a boat almost biblically rowed by 12 sailors and soldiers. And that was his entire advance and security contingent as he strode through the smoldering ruins of the Confederate capital. So I knew the bookends were going to be Jamestown and Lincoln, but I had no idea of the rich story that was going to fall in between there. A story of revolution and ultimately rebellion by the South, but also a story of Western expansion, and a hard story really about the conflicts between what became American people and Britain. This effort to pull together laws and put in place what grew over the course of a century into a complete slave code, what that did to people of African descent in Virginia and around the country. And I just had no idea that the story was going to be that compelling all the way through, connecting those bookends. That was my biggest surprise.
Yeah. When you think about all those stories and obviously the history that happened along the James is really unparalleled. And there's certain things that just happened along the James. But can you talk about some instances where the James actually played an active role in shaping that history?
Sure, absolutely. And you're right, it is unique. And when the book came out, I thought to myself, you know, if I really believe that the James River has this unique place in our history, I'm going to have to go down to the Mississippi Delta and try and sell the story down there. So I went to a number of bookstores down there in Tupelo and Natchez and Greenville and Greenwood, down all the way down the Delta to New Orleans. I'm not sure I made any converts, Bill, but the story held up. And I did have a lot of people tell me somebody should do for the Mississippi what you've done for the James. But the fact is, the James River was the sort of umbilical cord that pulled the English into this new land. And when you think about it, all the things we were talking about, Jamestown is settled in 1607, of course, as you know, and you see to harrowing effect in the book. They struggled to survive the first several years. In fact, at one point, the colony actually collapsed, and the last of the inhabitants shut the place down, got in a ship and headed downstream, bound back for London, when they were met by another group coming upstream who literally forced them at the point of a cannon to go back to Jamestown and make a go of it again. So it was tough going. But by 1619, when you have the first democratic body in the Western Hemisphere and the first Africans to come up the river in chains, remember, that all happened a year before the Mayflower even set sail for Plymouth. And so that is unique. That's where this began. The river itself nourished these great plantations up and down the river and nourished the nation's first cash crop, which was tobacco. It provided not only the land for this growth, but also importantly, the line of communication and transportation that this tobacco could be shipped abroad with. This was the beginnings of what would become the capital aggregation that would help to pay for the Revolutionary War, the formation of global markets that in time would lead to Wall Street, insurance, navigation, everything else that we understand to be the building blocks of the greatest economy in the history of the world. So all of that was unique. And then, of course, when you go all the way to the Civil War and you come down to the fact that that war ended only when the Confederate forces guarding Richmond's southern door were overwhelmed by Grant, and you have Lincoln literally coming up the river to hoist the American flag over the Virginia state capitol for the first time in 4 years in early April 1865.
That's really powerful. You had mentioned earlier that the rich soil and how important that was to producing crops. One thing, I don't know if you're aware, but also to share with others, the world corn yield record was set just a few years ago along the banks of the James at Curls Neck Farm. And so that continues on till today. It's pretty amazing.
Well, it's also a testament, I think, to the importance of the work that the James River Association is engaged in, trying to protect and improve and restore the health of this great river. There is so much at stake for the people of Virginia and elsewhere, really, in the restoration of the health of this river. And it's an uphill fight at the moment. You know, we have an administration that is trying to undermine the Clean Water Rule. That's a threat to not only great American waterways like the James River, but all the tributary streams and wetlands that feed the sources of a third of our drinking water around this country. And so it's important for associations like the James River Association to be standing up and advocating for these rivers, because they don't protect themselves. And in a world where increasingly there are, whether it's rapacious development, reckless industrial activity, or any of the sort, there are real threats to these waters, and there are real threats to the James River. As much as we love it, as much as we understand its importance, it has to be protected every day. And I know, Bill, you would be the first to say that it's the real heroes of this movement are the people who support your work. And so I wouldn't want that to go without being said.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, well, something that we say is clean water is no accident, and it's kind of like we're swimming against the tide. So if we don't keep going, we'll be swept downstream. Just a couple more questions for you, and then would love to hear thoughts, comments, questions from other participants. Again, apologize for the phone ringing. But what do you think the most important lesson is that we need to take from the history that's happened along the river for today?
I think the most important lesson that I took from the river is that we as a nation are the sum of all of our waters. And, you know, when I think about Maisie taking that sip out of the headwaters of the James, if she had taken that sip down further downstream, it would not be possible for her to drink just from the mountain waters, snow melt, or the waters off the Piedmont, or the black waters of the swamps of the Chickahominy River. It wouldn't be possible to pull that out. She would be drinking from an amalgamation of all those waters. That's what gives this river its great strength, so that by the time it empties itself into the Chesapeake Bay, it is nearly 5 miles wide. And it is that idea to me that just kept echoing throughout the book, that is our strength as a democracy, is all of our waters and all of our waters together. The strength of this country lies in our diversity. And that's why it's just so important that we have this kind of reckoning that we're going through right now, that we do elevate the voices that have been dimmed through the telling of our history, give them a more prominent place in the American achievement, give them more prominent place in our concept of American genius.
Yeah, it's wonderfully said. And I think, as you've pointed out, and I will say that in the introduction of the book, Bob does an incredible job of describing the metaphor that the river serves, being fed from so many different individual tributaries and streams and brooks, and coming together to form the mighty James, and how that's a parallel to our country. It's really powerful. So I encourage folks to seek out the book and read that, because it really made an impression on me as well. So with that, would love to hear thoughts or comments or questions from others in the time that we have?
You know, one thing that struck me was the English liked the James River because they could move in their big boats. I don't know if you can hear me, but.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir, I
we can
can.
hear you. So
The big boats, absolutely. That was, the English who came here in those first 3 boats, they had been given some very specific directions about the kind of place they should land. It had to be a place that they could defend because they feared the Spanish. The Spanish had already been in the area, but had left. And the English very much feared an attack by the Spanish. They feared that more than they feared attacks by the indigenous people. And so when you look at Jamestown, it's around a long bend. And so any ship that comes upstream is visible for a long period of time. But the other thing was it had to be a deep enough water that they could essentially tie their boats to the trees. And so these ships did take on some water, and Jamestown was just right because the water just offshore was deep enough to accommodate those large boats. And then the English, of course, under Captain John Smith and others, but most effectively John Smith, then used what we would think of as kind of a dinghy, if you will, to explore the more shallow waters in the creeks or the tributaries.
Is shallop.
Shallop, that's right.
Yeah,
Good.
which
That's
they built. Actually, a number of replicas were built for 2007, but one of them was supported by the National Geographic Society and actually retraced his voyages around the Chesapeake, which is a great way to really share that story with more folks.
Yeah.
Other thoughts or questions? Ale, I can't believe you're just going to sit there and be quiet.
All right, I'm in.
Tim.
Lynchburg in the house.
All right.
Lynchburg.
Can we post a link to the book and everything like that?
Be happy to.
Perfect.
Bob, is it still available?
It sure is, and I'll be happy to send a link to you, Bill.
Great.
Perfect. Thank you.
Be happy to distribute.
Thanks for asking. One of the best days I had reporting this was a visit to Lynchburg, and I went there during the Bateau Festival.
Perfect.
And it was so beautiful, just stunning, the water there, and then just downstream I went during the fall with some Monacan Indians, some Monacan people, and we explored the banks just downstream from Lynchburg. It's just one of the most beautiful parts of the river.
Yeah, my story from Lynchburg is I grew up on Blackwater Creek that dumps into the James right there in downtown Lynchburg. And when I was a kid, I went fishing behind my house, and it was basically an open sewer.
Oh.
And my mom used to have to hose me down when I came back in the house. And so there were still fish in it right below the Lynchburg College Dam. And
Yeah.
I grew up a fisherman with my dad. And it was amazing. We survived Camille somehow or another. We were ready to bug out. And the Lynchburg College Dam has been in question since 1969, and it held till recently. It's still held. So, and literally, I go down to Holland's Mill Dam on the Blackwater Creek in the last couple of years, and now we catch smallmouth below the dam, and we see great bass and red eye, and it's just fantastic. It's so clean, and we're so happy. Everything has gotten better, and we literally used to see turds floating down the creek.
There's such a tribute to the kind of progress that
Yes.
the association and other advocates have made. And of course, I got to know the waters the same way you did, fishing with my father, mostly for me in Tuckahoe Creek and the Chickahominy River. But it does bring you in contact not only with the waters and the nature, but with your dad in a special way. And today I believe is National Go Fishing Day. So
It is.
Glad you brought that up.
Yep.
Yeah.
And thank you for your participation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Anybody else? Well, Bob, I'm going to give you a chance to make a plug for your newest book as well. And I'm interested to hear about the story behind that as well.
Well, thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. Actually, the mentioned earlier of the 1969 Hurricane Camille and the flooding that ensued, and gets mentioned in the book. The book is called The Bicycle Man, and it is the story of a 13-year-old paper boy whose mission of delivering the news every morning in the suburbs of Richmond becomes kind of a hero's journey into the riven heart of a nation torn by war in Vietnam, the struggle for civil rights, and the search for American purpose. The book begins on the day in 1968 that Dr. King is assassinated, and it ends in September of '69 on the day Ho Chi Minh died. In between, the paperboy, whose name is Sandy Rivers, experiences young love, his first job, and of course trying to make sense of these inscrutable headlines. And as he does so, he is helped along the way as he experiences great joy and really heartbreaking loss. He is helped along the way by a mysterious figure he knows only as the Bicycle Man.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to reading that one. And if everyone can see the chat box, we posted a link to The River Where America Began and how you can order that.
Bill,
Yes.
I just looked it up on Amazon too, and they have 2 left.
Oh, is that right? Wow.
And some used ones for $2.74.
Go for that. Maybe somebody's written some interesting notes in the margins.
And check your
Oh,
local
but buy
library.
it new. At least tell him you're going to buy it new.
I'm going to buy it.
Thanks,
But
man.
there's one left.
Got it. Very good. Well, Bob, again, thank you so much for joining us, and everyone for taking time out for a little conversation and conservation. And hope to see you again sometime soon. Look forward to the time that we can get together in person. We'd much rather do this while we're floating. Actually, Bob, the name of our education boat is the Spirit of the James.
That's
and
lovely.
so we'd love to do that at some point.
I'm going to pass that on to Maisie.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you,
you,
Bill.
everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Nice
Thank
talking to
you. Great program.
Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Sarah,
everybody.
anything to wrap up?
She's muted.
Sorry about
Very
that. Let me see if I can share my screen one last time. I just wanted to mention a new page that we've created for some great ways to connect with us. So let me share my screen. All right, so this is the page I was talking about. It's called beajameschanger.org, and it offers just awesome, great ways to become more involved and support JRA, including how to follow us on social media for river updates, joining our action network to receive information about the latest river policy issues, investing in the protection of the James by making a contribution, and taking steps to a cleaner river by joining our River Hero Home program. So just wanted to share those as well with you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And we can't do what we do without supporters like all of you. So thanks again for joining us this evening, and have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Good show. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.